Radio Voice Italia.
Philadelphia.
Class is now in session. Christopher Columbus University is on air from Philadelphia and broadcasting worldwide from within the shadow of Marconi Plaza. Radio Voice Italia is proud to present a recurring segment with civil rights author, professional researcher, and renowned Christopher Columbus expert, Robert Felix Petrone, Esquire.
Buongiorno tutti and welcome to Radio Voice Italia's Christopher Columbus University, where we teach you the truth about the greatest hero of the 15th and 16th centuries, Christopher Columbus, and update you on the international efforts to preserve Christopher Columbus's legacy. I'm your host, il professore, Robert Petrone. Today on our Christopher Columbus University segment, some news updates. The city of Newark has replaced its Washington Park Christopher Columbus statue with a statue of Harriet Tubman. Mayor Ras Baraka called replacing Columbus's statue with Tubman's statue, quote, poetic. He said, quote, Harriet Tubman actually stepped foot here in this property. Christopher Columbus did not, so it seems more appropriate to have a statue of Harriet Tubman. Yeah, well, here's some news for you, Ras Baraka. Harriet Tubman doesn't hold a candle to Christopher Columbus when it comes to civil rights activism. Harriet Tubman participated in one Underground Railroad. Christopher Columbus organized and conducted not one, not two, but 3 Underground Railroads, and was a civil rights lobbyist. On his second voyage to the New World, Columbus traveled from island to island, rescuing Tainos who had been captured and enslaved by the Caribs, a murderous tribe of cannibals who had launched a campaign of genocide against all the other tribes of the Caribbean, a campaign of genocide that Christopher Columbus put a stop to. And it wasn't the first campaign of genocide that Christopher Columbus had put a stop to. And that was only the first Underground Railroad Columbus conducted. On subsequent return voyages from Hispaniola, Columbus continued to shuttle back to Spain tribal peoples that the Hidalgos had enslaved against his wishes and the wishes of the crown, and had them freed from servitude. He did this so many times, the exasperated Queen of Spain demanded Columbus stop because the crown didn't know what to do with all these freed slaves. That's at least 2 more Underground Railroads Columbus conducted, and 2 more than Tubman's list. After he returned from his last voyage and seeing the Hidalgos continuing to enslave tribal peoples, Christopher Columbus successfully petitioned King Ferdinand to pass the first civil rights legislation of the Americas, decreeing that, quote, all the Indians of Hispaniola were to be left free, not subject to servitude, unmolested and unharmed, and allowed to live like free vassals under law, just like any other vassal in the kingdom of Castile. Harriet Tubman did no such thing for enslaved Africans. So, Mayor Ras Baraka, if you think it's poetic to replace Christopher Columbus with someone who did far less than he did for civil rights, you need a serious lesson in iambic pentameter. The mainstream U.S. media continues to fail to report on the landmark decision by Italy's parliament to defend Christopher Columbus Day and his statues in the United States. The motion was made by parliament members Fusia Nisoli and Federico Mollicone and passed by the Chamber of Deputies. On behalf of Italian Americans living here in the United States and abroad, we thank these magnanimous members of Italy's parliament for their efforts and support. Italian Americans in Medford, Massachusetts have risen up against the Medford School Board and Medford City Council, demanding they, quote, stop fomenting hatred of Italian Americans, according to the Italian American Alliance chairman, Dr. Dominic Amara. The Medford group paid out of their own pockets to print and distribute hundreds of signs urging people to stop the hate against Italians. They are also planning to run candidates for the Medford School Board and City Council to prevent autocratic and Marxist pressure groups from coercing the Medford municipal bodies into committing Italophobic acts of discrimination, such as the group Our Revolution. The Italian-American community of New Britain, Connecticut, seeks to celebrate Christopher Columbus Day 2021 by adding an engraving to the base of the New Britain Columbus statue, honoring Italian-American veterans from New Britain who served in foreign wars. The local Italian-American Alliance successfully convinced the mayor and city council to reject demands by aggressive radicals to remove the statue based on their false accusations of genocide by Columbus and other lies. Now, the Italian-American community seeks to honor their ancestors, courageous veterans, and fallen war heroes with an inscription at the base of the statue reading, quote, "This statue, erected in 1941, stands as an enduring witness to the courage, dedication, and faith of our New Britain's Italian-American war veterans who, in the spirit of Columbus, ventured into a new world for the glory of God and country." Patrons of this endeavor seek to recontextualize the statue by focusing on what it meant to Italian Americans of the time and continues to mean for the Italian American community today. You can find a GoFundMe website online to help support the New Britain, Connecticut fundraising campaign for the new Columbus statue engraving. On this week's substantive portion of our class, I'd like to discuss a matter that my last guest, Andre Domino, brought up after our on-the-air interview in our last episode, episode 10. Mr. Domino is a civil rights activist for Italian Americans and an executive board member of the Italian American One Voice Coalition, which, along with many Italian and Italian American organizations such as Figli Italia International and the Sons and Daughters of Italy, is a member of the umbrella organization, the Conference of Presidents of Major Italian American Organizations. Mr. Domino is also co-chair of the Conference of Presidents subcommittee to coordinate efforts of Italian American anti-defamation groups, along with Robert Ferrito. After my interview with Mr. Domino, when the audio stopped recording, he told me an interesting fact to which I thought was important enough to dedicate this episode. And you may recall in episode 10, I interviewed Mr. Domino about the Italian American One Voice Coalition's rousing victory over the Randolph, New Jersey School Board and their attempt not only to replace Christopher Columbus Day with the incorrectly titled Indigenous Peoples Day. No one is indigenous to the Americas. The tribal peoples were the first colonizers of the American continent, but also to eliminate the names of all holidays, replacing them with the indistinct term day off. The Italian American One Voice Coalition not only got the Randolph Board of Ed to return the holiday names to the calendar, but to return Christopher Columbus Day to the calendar, as Mr. Domino explained in that exhilarating interview. But interestingly, he told me after our interview that what likely played a huge part in changing the mind of the school board, which ended up voting 8-1 to return Columbus Day to the calendar, was pointing out to them that Columbus Day was first celebrated in 1892 as a form of apology and atonement to Italian Americans for the largest lynching in American history, which was not of Africans or African Americans, but the lynching of Italian Americans in New Orleans in 1891. By the way, I visited the site of the New Orleans lynching 2 years ago, and there is nothing at the site commemorating the victims of that mass murderous hate crime. Rather, Mahalia Jackson Theater stands at that site in what is called Louis Armstrong Park. How's that for a double smack in the collective face of Italian Americans? Anyway, Mr. Domino told me that the board member he spoke to was completely ignorant of the lynching, much less that Columbus Day was an act of apology for it, and that the board member was absolutely surprised by it, and that he then said to Mr. Domino, "Oh, well, that may well change things." Apparently it did, considering that the same board that voted to remove Columbus Day then voted 8-1 to put it back. Now, this made very clear to me that in this age of oppression Olympics, the notion that the most oppressed wheel gets the grease, that such a point clearly carries a lot of weight with such Marxists as the Randolph School Board and other public school boards and municipal city councils and mayors and so on. This is clearly an argument that gains traction. It may be a Marxist argument, but as the Marxist activist Saul Alinsky counseled in the 1960s, use your opponent's tactics against them. So I thought that in the interest of helping Italian American activists out there to build their argument arsenals against the Marxists, we take a page from the Marxists themselves and explain to them why Italian Americans, who are people of color because they come from the Italic Peninsula, the middle of the Mediterranean, and hence the epicenter of genetic commingling in the early Western world, have also been subjected to a history of oppression for which Christopher Columbus Day is our reparations. Just like affirmative action and the welfare state, were reparations for African slavery. So prepare your pens and notebooks, students. Here is the history of Italophobic oppression in the United States. In the late 1700s to the 1800s, Italian immigrants living in New Orleans before the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, yeah, that's right, there were Italians in the Americas in the late 1700s. You didn't know that, did you? They were labeled foreign, dangerous, culturally backward, and racially suspect by Northern European settlers. In the 1880s to 1890s, anti-papists vandalized and burned Italian churches and charities across the country. Mobs attacked Italian Americans and lynched more than 20 Italian Americans in the 1890s alone. Italian immigrants faced police brutality, stereotyping, and discrimination in housing and employment. They were blamed for taking American jobs. Pseudo-scientific theories emerged that Italians were inherently inferior to other human beings. In 1891, the largest mass lynching in American history claimed 11 lives in New Orleans. All of the victims were Italian Americans. Their corpses were riddled with bullets, looted, torn apart by the crowd, and hung or otherwise put on display. Lynch mob organizer John M. Parker, later elected governor of Louisiana, characterized Italian Americans as filthy, lawless, and treacherous. The New York Times applauded the killings, referring to Italian Americans as ruffians, descendants of bandits, and a pest without mitigations. Wait a minute, ruffians? When have we heard that recently about Italian Americans in Philadelphia? By recently, I mean within the past year. Check the Twitter feeds of your elected officials, my fellow Philadelphians. In 1899, 3 Italian-American shopkeepers and their 2 Italian-American customers were lynched in Tallulah, Louisiana. At the turn of the 20th century, ethnic epithets for Italian immigrants became widespread, such as Guinea, Dago, and Wop. Approximately 50 lynchings of Italian immigrants in the United States are documented between 1890 and 1920. Italian arrivals at Ellis Island were separated from their families and returned to Italy for failing eye exams or appearing too frail for manual labor, giving rise to the dubbing of Ellis Island L'Isola delle Lagrime, the Isle of Tears. Immigration officials butchered the names and surnames of many Italian arrivals permitted to enter the United States, forever after altering the nomenclature of their family lineages. In the early 20th century, Italian Americans were subjected to virulent prejudice, nativist hostility, and widespread discrimination by other ethnic groups and anti-papists. Italian immigrants were restricted in housing to low-income tenements that were cramped, poorly lit, underventilated, without indoor plumbing, and hotbeds of vermin and disease such as cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis. Italian immigrants were among the lowest paid workers, restricted to manual labor jobs in unhealthy working conditions. Those demanding better working conditions and shorter working hours in the mining, textile, garment, construction, and other businesses were branded as labor agitators and radicals. In 1920, Italian Americans were blamed for the bombing of Wall Street by anti-capitalists and were deported by the hundreds. Italian immigrants Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were executed as anarchists, though decades later, they were posthumously deemed not guilty and wrongly convicted. 1921 to 1924, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924, restricting immigration from Italy and ending the Italian wave of immigration. In 1924, Literary Digest Weekly magazine, published by Funk and Wagnalls, declared Italian immigrants to be, quote, inborn, socially inadequate, feeble-minded, and suffering from deformities and innate criminality. In the 1920s to the 1930s, Hollywood and the mainstream media portrayed Italian Americans as violent, sociopathic gangsters, perpetuating the pervasive, age-old stereotypes of Italians as overly aggressive, ruffians and bandits well into the 20th century. World War II saw President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issue Executive Order 9066, interring hundreds of Italian Americans, forcing thousands more from their homes and subjecting their homes to raids and confiscation. Italian Americans permitted to remain in their homes were subjected to curfews and a travel restriction of 5 miles. They were granted no exceptions, not even to attend a relative's funeral or to visit their sons in uniform at American military installations. Anything that could be used as a signaling device, such as shortwave radios and flashlights, were confiscated from Italian American homes. People of Italian descent were prohibited from working near San Francisco's waterfront areas for fear that they would signal Axis ships. All unnaturalized Italian Americans, 600,000, were forced to carry enemy alien identification papers. Neighbors viewed Italian Americans with suspicion and fear, and former customers ceased patronizing Italian American businesses. Did your parents or grandparents tell you about any of this? No, of course they didn't. Now, listeners, I tell you all this not to denigrate America, but quite to the contrary, as someone who is not only a patriot, but a civil rights author and attorney, someone who deeply understands why the United States is now the freest, least racist, heterogeneous country in the world. Yes, Italian Americans suffered, but we believed in America. We worked hard. We built ourselves up, generation by generation, starting as stonemasons, tailors, and barbers, transitioning to white-collar jobs in the next generation until we were not only firmly entrenched in the American middle class, but made up a significant portion of it as professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and so forth. Yes, the government apologized by giving us Christopher Columbus Day. Yes, the tribal peoples of the Americas suffered and deserve a day of their own on August 9th, the day the UN has designated in their honor. But this suffering is not an indication that America is evil or structurally racist or fundamentally flawed. Quite the contrary. It was part of our growing pains. And we did grow and mature as a nation. We grew, as I said, into the freest, least racist, heterogeneous country in the world. And anybody who thinks that isn't worth celebrating on Christopher Columbus Day and on the 4th of July, which, as this airs, is the next holiday on our national calendar, is not only someone who hates America, but who hates humanity. As a proud American and member of Western culture, I love humanity. I love the United States, and I hope you do too. Keep the faith, fight the Marxists trying to erase Christopher Columbus and other American icons, and happy Independence Day. And that's today's class. For more news, articles, and resources about Christopher Columbus as the first civil rights activist of the Americas, icon of Western culture, paragon of Catholic virtue, and greatest hero of the 15th and 16th centuries, visit preservecolumbus.us. That's Preserve Columbus, rendered as one word, .us. And post a little note of appreciation for our webmaster, Tom LaCosta. I'm il professore Robert Petrone. A presto.
The Jersey Shore has fun and sun, sand and sea, and
Radio Voice Italian.
This is Radio Voice Italia, USA.